You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, and this time, unfortunately, I'm not joined by my regular co-host, Katie Putz. She is often traveling in South Korea currently, but in her stead, I'm very happy to have back on the show after a pretty long time, Sebastian Strangio, the Diplomat's Southeast Asia editor. Sebastian, it's great to have you back. Hope you've been well.
Thanks, Ankit. It's good to be here.
So, as listeners may know, the United States and Vietnam took a major diplomatic step over the weekend, actually sort of leapfrogging their diplomatic relationship to what Vietnam prefers to call a comprehensive strategic partnership. That's what the two countries announced when President Joe Biden visited Hanoi to meet with his Vietnamese counterpart. Now, of course, this is interesting for a variety of reasons. The expectation in the lead up to the summit was that the two countries would elevate their relationship to a comprehensive partnership. That has now become a comprehensive strategic partnership. There's a lot of, I think, geopolitical context to untangle here, Sebastian, and I'm glad to have you to sort of help us do that. I think the place to start is with this announcement of the elevation. Sometimes when you read diplomatic statements, words like comprehensive strategic partnerships and elevating relationships can sort of begin to lose their meaning. But there's been a lot of focus among analysts who focus on Vietnam in particular on this decision by Hanoi. What do you make of it? Were you sort of surprised by the choice here, particularly Hanoi's willingness to take this step despite the optics of leapfrogging and elevating the relationship in this sort of rapid fire way?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think 6 months ago, opinion among Vietnam observers of Vietnam was split. There were a lot of people who were skeptical that the Vietnamese wanted to upgrade the relationship to a strategic partnership. Then was what people were talking about. There was no talk that it would leapfrog straight to the top tier of Vietnam's diplomatic hierarchy. But people at the time were arguing that the U.S. was very keen on this upgrade. I think that the substance of U.S. Vietnam relations have for many years lagged behind the formal designation. But that the Vietnamese, the Communist Party of Vietnam, were a lot more cautious about it. They were cautious about the reaction from Beijing, and they were also cautious about, some of the securocrats in the CPV are still worried about the U.S. potentially interfering in Vietnam's domestic affairs by fomenting a peaceful evolution toward democratic rule. But there seems to have been, if indeed Hanoi was reluctant, there seems to have been a change in their view on this. And the fact that I was quite surprised that they decided to leapfrog the strategic partnership and go straight to the comprehensive strategic partnership, something that they've only done in one other case, and that was with China in 2008.
Right. I think that's a very interesting observation. Let's talk about China for a second. Right. I feel like this happens a lot on the Asia Geopolitics podcast of late when we talk about U.S. ties with any other country. China's, of course, looming in the background. And Biden, he's a straight shooter when it comes to these issues, and he spoke rather openly in Vietnam about containment of China, right? I mean, specifically saying that it was not about containing China, trying to offer reassurances from Hanoi to Beijing. I wonder how that went over in Vietnam, if the intention here was to indicate that this was a relationship that was deepening for its own reasons with very little to do about China. But, Biden talked about having a stable base, about seeking new partners in the Indo-Pacific. And I think he's right. I mean, there's a lot of kind of consistency to that going back arguably all the way to Obama's second term when Vietnam's ties with China, particularly in the South China Sea, took a nosedive in 2013 and 2014, particularly in 2014 after the notorious oil rig incident in the South China Sea. So what do you make here of the U.S. approach? How's that sort of reading from where you sit and more generally among the analysts who look at Vietnam's broader approach to the U.S.-China geopolitical conundrums that Hanoi faces?
I think it's difficult to disentangle it from American policy toward China. The Biden administration has made a lot of efforts to consolidate relationships with key partners in the region. We've seen advances in the security relationship with the Philippines, quite significant advances since President Marcos came into power last year. And I think that they've decided to focus on a few nations that share some of their concerns about Chinese behavior and ambition. I mean, Biden saying this has nothing to do with containment of China, I think, is something that he sort of has to say, both for reasons of, because that's basically how the Vietnamese are framing it as well. And also, this has been the case across the board with U.S. diplomacy in Asia or in the Indo-Pacific, as you might refer to it. They rarely refer to China openly, and they want. I think they recognize that it's important that relationships are framed in their own terms and not simply as a subset of Washington's China policy. And so, but I do think we wouldn't be seeing the rapid advances in the relationship between Vietnam and the United States without this concern, this background thrum of concern about China's growing power and its ambitions in the region. I think that's probably true also on the Vietnamese side. I mean, this is not all about China for them. The upgrade, the leapfrogging, is not about Vietnam taking the United States side in a binary struggle for dominance in Asia. It is an expression of Vietnam's long-standing independent and what they refer to as omnidirectional foreign policy. But that independent and omnidirectional foreign policy, which is based around building relationships with as many partners as possible, is in some senses an outgrowth of Vietnam's very awkward geostrategic location, which is, the fact that it shares a border with China and is experiences the pressure of being next to this big country, as well as the complexity of having such close historical ties to it, especially amongst the communists, between the two communist parties. And so I do think that China is an important factor here, even if there are, a lot of other benefits that Vietnam can derive from a closer partnership with the United States.
Yeah, and also on the history, obviously Vietnam fought wars with both China and the United States, which of course looms in the background in many ways, although obviously bears very little relevance today to the state of particularly U.S. Vietnam ties. Looking through the joint statement issued at the summit, it's really interesting. You sort of scroll through it and you see really a heavy focus, I think, on kind of desecuritizing the context of this summit, right? There's a lot on, a range of kind of hot topics, everything from kind of semiconductors to technology partnerships, science and technology research, people-to-people ties. If you're talking about a strategic global partnership, I mean, there is really an attempt to show that the United States and Vietnam have a lot more to talk about when their leaders meet than just the China question. And I think that's been actually a pretty strong through line in the broader U.S. approach to Vietnam, probably actually going back to just to go back to the second term of the Obama administration, the efforts to pull Vietnam into the TPP, which of course the U.S. never entered. But that I thought was an interesting way to sort of give some heft to this idea that, Vietnam in particular is sort of pursuing this relationship with the U.S. as an expression of its own autonomy. Did anything sort of jump out to you in terms of the deliverables? I mean, there's just this incredibly long list of, strategic ports and energy infrastructure, travel, transport, tourism, climate resiliency, just a long laundry list of items. Did anything in particular kind of stand out to you?
Nothing in particular, but I think it is very interesting that, the Vietnamese have emphasized that they can derive a lot of economic benefits from a closer partnership with the United States, and that we are publishing an article today by a member of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, writing in a personal capacity, of course, but he argues that if Vietnam is to escape the middle income trap, support from the United States for high technology industries like semiconductors, will be crucial for the country to climb the value chain and secure its long-term economic future. And the fact that the Vietnamese have chosen, the official title of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership is the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership for Peace, Cooperation, and Sustainable Development, which I think emphasizes the Vietnamese government's desire to focus, to move beyond the simple security focus, which does dominate the American engagement with Southeast Asia more generally.
Hmm.
Even though I think you're right that there has been a very substantial economic component to U.S. Vietnam relations for quite some time. But yes, I think this for the Vietnamese, this is as much about economics as it is about security.
Right. Let's talk about security quickly before we wrap up. So just to kind of contextualize for listeners, Hanoi has, as you pointed out, an omnidirectional foreign policy. Famously, with its defense policy, Vietnam maintains the three no's policy of no alliances, no foreign basing on its territory, and no alignment with a second country against a third. And I think that very much kind of permeates its engagement here with the United States. So again, to go back to the joint statement, when you look at the language in the paragraphs on defense and security, which interestingly comes very far down the joint statement, right? And I think that's a pretty deliberate choice, probably by the Vietnamese side. And then the language in those paragraphs is really quite anodyne, right? We don't see language here on kind of freedom of navigation and the South China Sea and the rules-based order, as you might see in kind of similar paragraphs in U.S. statements with certainly treaty allies, but also countries that have been longer term partners, perhaps. But the language here is, trafficking of narcotics, cybercrime, United Nations peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance operations, and I think that's a really interesting framing here. What do you make of that, Sebastian? And then, sort of, I guess, a supplementary question here geopolitically is, where do things go from here between the U.S. and Vietnam? I mean, things have come a very long way. I remember doing podcasts on U.S. Vietnam relations, almost 10 years ago, and it's really kind of remarkable to look back at this moment and how far the two countries have come. But where do things go from here, and what do you make more broadly on the defense relationship at this point?
I think just as the fact that the economic deliverables have been front-ended in the public announcements of this upgrade, the Vietnamese are very cautious about sending a message to the Chinese government that this is not about Vietnam joining an anti-China coalition. This upgrade is not even really geared towards China at all. They've been quite interestingly, they've also in the past few months announced pending upgrades with Australia, Indonesia, and Singapore, almost as if to tell Beijing, look, we're upgrading the United States, but this is not that big a deal. We're doing this with a lot of our partners.
Diluting it almost.
Yes, exactly. Almost diluting the significance of the move. And this significance, this is an upgrade that I think the United States has been wanting for a long time. And so I think that the Vietnamese have managed to thread the needle fairly well. Beijing would have been notified of this through party-to-party channels, I'm sure. So this would not have come as a surprise to the Chinese government. I think in the defense front, we're likely to see we're not going to see that much change. I mean, a comprehensive strategic partnership doesn't really mean anything. It's sort of a floating signifier. It doesn't come with any automatic, deals or agreements that are unlocked by sort of achieving this level. And that gives the Vietnamese a certain degree of flexibility about, how and when they decide to develop closer relations with the United States in this regard, in terms of, arms deals or closer cooperation in maritime security. I think that we're not going to see anything that touches on, hard security arrangements in the South China Sea. It's all going to be, as you say, these anti-piracy measures, cybercrime, these softer forms of security cooperation that can help to develop the relationship, but not step across any, the threshold that might prompt an angry response from the Chinese government. I think that the Vietnamese are still very cautious about how far they go in this regard. For instance, that just this month it was announced that Vietnam is seeking to procure more military material from the Russians, which sort of indicates that defense relationship will remain very much salient for the Vietnamese into the foreseeable future. Over the longer term, it's harder to say. I think that what needs to happen now is for the Vietnamese to decide exactly how to, what they need in order to safeguard their sovereignty in the South China Sea, But I think that there's a certain point at which I think things will sort of hit a limit as to how far they can go in in building defense ties with the United States, and perhaps more multilateral or minilateral approaches will be more to the Vietnamese government's liking. A lot also depends on Chinese actions and how far they push things. I
Exactly.
mean, so far the Vietnamese have been very good at quarantining their relationship with China. In some ways, a very close and productive economic relationship, and a very intimate party-to-party relationship between the two communist parties from the maritime and territorial disputes that are outstanding between them. Whether that's possible if China continues to push and continues with its aggressive actions offshore remains to be seen. But I do think that Vietnam will be very cautious in expanding its defense cooperation with the United States, despite this latest upgrade.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. I mean, I was about to make that, make a similar observation. Just going back to 2014 and kind of thinking about the major oil rig standoff that almost spiraled completely out of control. It did serve as a major accelerant and a bit of a wake up call, I think, in Hanoi for the reality of managing, I think, this complex relationship with China, which, as you said, has the party-to-party component, the long history, the economic component. But certainly, I think Vietnam is now well past, I think, hedging in its approach to the United States more broadly. I think that's sort of the takeaway I have with the last several years of what's happened here. But Sebastian, it's always great to have you on. Thanks a lot for coming on today to provide your insights and analysis on the U.S. Vietnam relationship.
Thanks, Ankit. I look forward to the next time.
Absolutely. For listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe to keep up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. You can do that anywhere you get your podcasts. It really helps the show out. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.